Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be telling you about an album that I think is an essential album for anybody who's a fan of jazz rock or jazz fusion, whatever you want to call it. It's this album here by Mike Stern. It's called Time and Place. It came out in 1988. If you try and find some decent jazz rock or jazz fusion in the 1980s, there's a lot less than there was in the 1970s, let us say. And the reason for that is that the commercial constraints on jazz fusion at the time meant that what was selling was the sort of Fusaki Muzak of Kenny G. This sort of cursed a lot of the output that came out on the GRP record label. Very middle of the road, very inoffensive. And if our jazz rock heroes weren't making music like that in the 1980s, they were often trying to get a crossover hit like Herbie Hancock had with Rocket. So you get lots of inane vocals, horrible Linn drums clattering all over the place, DX7 sounding awful, and lots of gated reverb and all sorts of horrors. Mike Stern here is a guitarist that emerged in the late 70s when he got the gig with Blood, Sweat and Tears, and then went on to play in Billy Cobham's band. He combined a sort of blues approach with a sort of jazz vocabulary, and he was brilliant in both of those areas. He had a cutting tone, and in many ways the idea of what a jazz rock guitarist that had emerged in the late 60s with Larry Coryell and John McLaughlin, this guy pulled a lot of those things together. He could play like Hendrix, but he could also play like Wes Montgomery, and he could do that at the same time. He managed to develop a style that people like John Scofield would also emerge in the 80s do something very similar. Of course, because he was able to scream on guitar, he was picked up by Miles Davis, who had brought him into his band on his comeback. And he debuted to the world, as far as I was concerned, on the track Fat Time on Miles Davis's comeback album from 1981 called The Man with the Horn. I believe that to be one of the greatest guitar solos of all time. Mike Stern feels like he's been let off the leash by Miles Davis. Just does an incredible solo that blew me away as a kid. So I started following this guy then. I listened to him on Star People, and after Star People he went. And he started to forge a solo career, but poor old Mike was suffering with drug addiction at this time. He'd hooked up with Jaco Pastorius, and they did lots of gigs and lots of recordings, but it was all a bit subpar as he battled with his addictions. Towards the mid-80s, it seems he managed to get himself back on track, and he brought out a series of albums that are actually very, very interesting, very exciting. And this is one of them. This came out in 1988. The lineup is pretty stellar. We've got Mike Stern on guitar, obviously. We've got Bob Berg, who had also played with Miles Davis in the 1980s band. I believe Bob Berg died in a car crash, very sad. He definitely died very young. A great loss to the world of jazz. And also on the tracks Gossip and Chromosome, we have Michael Brecker, another huge, important musician in the history of jazz that has died far too young. On keyboards, we've got Jim Beard. On bass, we've got Jeff Andrews. On drums, we've got Peter Erskine, playing very fusiony stuff. He was doing a lot of jazz stuff at that time, but very fusiony. Don Elias, late Don Elias on percussion, and the late Don Grolnick on organ, another jazz musician that died far too young. It's produced by Steve Kahn, the great Steve Kahn. Steve Kahn actually contacted me the other day on here on one of the comments. Now I can't find it. So Steve, if you're watching it, come on a channel. Come in. You're a legend of jazz rock, Steve, and I've got so many things to ask you. And I think, again, this is a testament to Steve Kahn's vision, in that he is able in 1988 to oversee this and not let it fall into all the horrible pitfalls that jazz musicians were falling in the 1980s. Now, it's a really interesting album. There's two tracks on here, both feature Michael Brecker. It opens with the track Gossip, and it closes with the now jazz standard Chromosome. And what happens on these tracks is Mike Stern creates melodies that have the sort of weave and interesting melodic flow of a bebop line, like a Charlie Parker line. Now, we know in the 70s that a lot of musicians were coming out of the Coltrane school, and then people like Scofield and Pat Metheny emerged. They then brought in this influence from Ornette Coleman. But I think that Mike Stern was the first guy to really bring in proper bebop influences into jazz rock fusion. I'm sure people will shout about the Brecker Brothers and some of those lines, but especially Chromazone, it was such a successful tune. It ended up in the Real Book, and everybody started to learn that boppish line. I've played it on a number of gigs over the years, and I think that Chromazone creates the style, or at least greatly influences the style that has become now the sort of standard approach for YouTube fusion. It starts here on this track, but the rest of the album goes through all sorts of different places. You know, there's funky stuff, there's slow ballad stuff, and there's some incredible tracks that just really build up, and in almost like a sort of Freebird, Lynyrd Skynyrd type of way, build up and reach some crescendos. Mike Stern's gone on to make a whole ton of brilliant albums. He is one of my favourite guitarists. Recently, he was coming out, I think, of a hotel on tour, and he tripped and landed on his arms, and he I think he broke his right arm pretty seriously. And when it healed, he'd lost the feeling and grip and all sorts of stuff, and he was no longer able to play the guitar really. But Mike, being a true creative musician, fought his way through this. He started gluing plectrums onto his fingers and did all sorts of stuff. I think he maybe had an operation or something to try, and he got a little bit back. But his picking hand has changed, and any normal musician would go, right, that's it now. I might go and play something else, you know, maybe to trumpet and just do it with left hand or whatever. But Mike has carried on playing, and his style has changed. But for me, what it has done is accentuated what happens to all great musicians, which is when you're young, you're full of chops, and it's all about speed and jumping through the hoops. So that's normally what gets you noticed. But as you develop, you start to get much more knowledge and much more integrated into the music. And because of that, your approach, I think most great artists, their approach becomes sketchy as they get older. They're much more interested in the truth rather than just being the perfection of jumping through, you know, gymnastic hoops. And that's accentuated Mike Stern's approach. He still blazes, he still burns, but he is a brilliant guitarist because of his knowledge, and his knowledge is so vast. You know, I'm friends with a guy called Beady Lenz who knows Mike, and he's had lessons with him, and he said, you cannot fathom how much knowledge this guy has got. And I think sometimes his sort of ability to play really cool blues licks obscures his ability and knowledge on the guitar. He copped a little bit of nastiness from trolls recently, and I supported him on here and made a video, and my mate Beady Lenz passed that video on to Mike, who watched the channel. So I cannot believe that these legends, these people I grew up with, watch the channel. You know, Steve Kahn and Mike Stern. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? I hope they're watching this one. I hope, Mike, you're watching this, and if you are, fantastic album. I bought it when it came out. I'm still listening to it now. I absolutely love this album. So that is the end of the video. A short one. It's a new thing I'm doing now, is just hammering out these little short videos, see if people like it when I don't witter on for ages and I'm much more concise. See how this gets on. You never know. Never know. Thanks for watching, everybody. Like, subscribe, and if you're really into what I do, think about becoming a patron. Links down below. And if you want to support me, I have the PayPal tip jar, and the links down below as well. Thank you very much. Bye bye.